Hello and welcome back to this tutorial series on Unreal Engine Audio. Today, we will be going over another tool for working with sound files, the sound cue. One issue that comes up in games is how to make your sounds non-repetitive. It can get old if you hear the same sounds repeatedly with no variation. However, if you want to use lots of sounds to counteract that, it can run into the issue of that using a lot of memory when you're importing all of those different sounds. So the way that Unreal Engine solves this issue is by using sound cues. The sound cues are a tool in the Unreal Engine that allow you to make the most of the audio that you have. It has many different functionalities that are quite useful when creating gameplay audio. To show you how to create a sound cue, we're going to head over to location 5 just to have an open space. So there are multiple ways to do this. But basically what you want to do is you first want to find a folder that you'll be creating this in. I just happen to have the frog folder open. The first way, and I would say the easiest way, is to right-click a sound, and then from that, you can choose Create Cue. Basically what this does is it takes the sound file, which in this case is one of these waves for frogs, create the cue, and it just creates a sound cue with the same name. That's one of the easiest ways to do it. The other way, using the wave files, is if I select multiple, let's say this many, and right-click, you have the option to either create a single cue and import all of the sound waves, or create multiple cues, one for each. The last way you can do it is just right-clicking in here, scrolling down. You want to go to Sounds, and then up here you can see the sound cue option. So let's just click that right there. We're going to name this Sound Cues Test. So once you have that created, you can open it up, and it'll bring you into the sound cue interface. To take a tour around the layout, we first have the toolbar up top, which allows you to save anything you've done within the level. Browse, which just opens up your content drawer. There's solo or mute, which if you're ever playing your sounds within the level and you want to just hear only that or mute it, you can do that within the sound cue. You can play the cue, which plays from the output, or you can stop the sound. And then down in here, we've got our other options, which just happen with the sound cue or output selected. Basically, there's memory, which works mainly for gameplay mechanics. There's the sound, which is the overall volume, as well as the pitch, as well as it gives you the option to change the sound class, which we'll be going over in another tutorial. And along with this, it has attenuation options, which you can either apply an attenuation or override in order to do all of those effects, which we'll be going over in another tutorial. If you're interested in that, be sure to check out the attenuation tutorials. Then we have the effects, which we'll be going over in a later tutorial. Our voice management, if you have it on restart, that means anytime you trigger this sound, it'll start from the beginning of the sound file. If you have play when silent, it will continue to loop even when you're not there. The problem with that is that it takes up a good amount of memory. Then there's the priority and concurrency, which we will be talking about later. These last two have more to do with game developer side of things and less with audio. To talk about the center section here, this is known as the event graph. This is where we implement the functionality that we want within our sound cue. The way that most event graphs in Unreal Engine work is through what is known as visual coding. Every piece of functionality is represented by a node, such as this output. The graph then flows from left to right, with inputs being on the left, like this, and outputs being on the right. And its destination will end up at the output, and that will be what you hear within the sound cue. So to talk about the actual sound nodes, all of the options that we have are over here in the sound node section. While I'll be going over each of these nodes at least briefly, a good way to check what these nodes do in the Unreal Engine is to just hover your mouse over it when it is in the event graph. So if I were to take, say, the mature, if I hover over it, it gives you a bit of a description about what it does. First, we're going to be covering the most common nodes for audio, and then we'll give a quick overview of the other nodes available. There will be time codes included to skip to if you want to find a specific node. For placing nodes within the editor, there are three ways that you can do it. You can either drag in from the sound node section, you can right-click and type in what you want, say if I want the mixer, or you can drag out of an output, and it gives you the option to either choose or type in and search for that, which automatically connects it. I find this to be one of the most useful ways to do it, as it automatically connects up your nodes. Now, once you have your node in the event graph, it's time to actually make it have some sound. So the way that we do this is by using the wave player. As you can see here, this is our wave player. Now, the interesting thing is that this only has an output, and this only has an input. Basically, everything in your sound cue is going to start from the wave player or multiple wave players and make its way to the output. This is quite a simple node, as it only has a few detail settings. It has what sound wave you're going to be using. You can either click here and type, or if you have one in here that you want, say this frog, as long as you have it highlighted, if you click on this Use Selected Actor, it automatically puts that into the wave player. Or, again, you can just browse down here and choose. If you want to reset this, just click the back button, and that'll reset your value. The second setting that it has is the looping setting. So if I were to just play this, let's get that frog going. If I were to just play this once, it would just play once and be done. But if I change it to looping, this changes the wave player to a looping wave player, and now, isn't that lovely? Clicking on the wave player node and dragging it in is not the only way to get a sound wave into the player. Some more efficient ways are, say I want just this one in here, I can drag and drop it directly into the sound cue, which is incredibly helpful. Not only this, but you can actually drag in multiple sound waves at once, just like this. Or, an even more efficient way to do it is, say I want all of these to be going together to some other node. If I have all of these highlighted and right-click in the event graph, it has the option for From Selected. This allows you to attach all of those waves to a single sound node. So say I wanted it in the mixer, I click that. All of these are now attached to the mixer. This can save you a lot of time, especially when you're working with multiple wave files. When you have these within the editor, another way to play the cue would be to double-click on whatever node you're on. That allows you to hear what that node is. When we create longer loops and longer strings, if we want to hear what it sounds like at a certain part along the path, you would just double-click that node, and it would play from there, not necessarily from the output. The question is, how would we get multiple sounds to play at once? As you can see, the output only has one input section, and that begs the question of how we would get multiple sounds layered on top of each other, say for creating a more interesting wind ambient sound. The way that we would do this is through the mixer node. If we click that and drag it in here, we can see that the mixer has multiple inputs and a single output. All that the options have up here are the input volume, which just change the volume of whatever inputs we have. So let's fill this in with some sounds and hear what this sounds like. So normally if we were to have this in here, even though we have the wave player back here when we play it, all you hear is the wind. But if we were to move this around and have it playing through the mixer, we can now have both of these playing at the same time. Now for my taste, the grass is a little bit loud, so I'll just take that and lower it down to where I like it. And if you wanted to add more than two, you just click this Add Input button, and that adds however many you need. The only annoying thing is that as soon as you create these inputs, I haven't found a way to delete them. So make sure that you know what you want to add before you add inputs to the mixer. Now, as some of you probably noticed, I ended up deleting one of these attachments. In order to do that, all you have to do is hold down Alt or Option on Mac, and then just click on the strand that you want to delete. While the mixer is helpful, the random node is one of the nodes that I have used the most in my work in the Unreal Engine. The random node is best used when working with one-shots, which are finite sounds such as frogs croaking that are either played once when triggered or played repeatedly for ambiance. But when you have a sound that will be repeating a lot, you don't want to have the exact same sound playing repeatedly. Instead, it's an efficient method to bring in slight variations to the sound and randomly select one of these to play. So to show you an example, kind of like I did earlier with the mixer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the frogs section, and I'm going to select these frog sounds. All of these are slight variations on a croak, as you can hear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of these, right-click in the event graph, and then it'll bring me the option to give a random for multiple waves. Now I have all of these frogs going into one random, and what that means is if I were to play the output, it will randomly select one of the frog sounds. As far as the settings go within here, the first thing we need to talk about is this randomize without replacement. By default, this is checked, and what this means is that after one of the sounds is played, it is removed from the list of sounds to play next until all sounds have been played. This helps minimize the repetitiveness of your sounds. So to give an example of that, as soon as I play it, this sound is no longer in the running for what will be played next. It will cycle through every other sound before going back and repeating that initial sound. However, if you want more control over how often a sound appears, you need to uncheck the randomize without replacement. This allows for true randomness and will always select from the entire sound pool. While this is slightly more repetitive, it allows you to use weighting for when you're choosing a random sound. And what I mean by that is that if we go up here to this weight setting, it shows all of the different nodes that are being input, and it shows their relative weighting. So what this currently means is that all of these have a 1 in 12 chance of being chosen as the sound to be played. But if, say, we had an extra sound that we didn't want to play as much, say this one, because it has a lot more pause to it, but we didn't want that to appear very frequently, we could take that weighting and drop it down to about 0.1. You could also type in the values in here as well. To give you a clearer example of that, let's attach it to a single random node. We'll just have these two. So if I were to uncheck this and make this one 0.1, this one now has 1/10 of the chance of being picked as the first index. So if we click this, you can see that the first one is being chosen much more frequently than the second. So having that randomized without replacement unchecked gives you that control with weighting. This is a great tool for trying to get as much varied sound design as possible. One issue that arrives with the random node is that if we were to play the node, it would only play once when triggered, much like how I've been having to click the output multiple times to get it to play multiple times in a row. This is where we bring in the looping node. This allows whatever is fed into it to be in a loop. If we drag that in from here, reconnect these, we now have it looping, so when we play the cue, it will continue to loop as long as it is triggered. A couple of the options that we have, the initial option is that it will loop indefinitely, or you can choose to loop it for a certain amount of times. So if I were to place 3 here, press play, plays it 3 times. This is useful in conjunction with other looping nodes. Say if you had a blacksmith that you wanted it to hit 3 times or 5 times and randomly choose that, a good way to do it is to drag in multiple looping nodes, as well as a random node, and have each of these loopings go into the random. Now if we uncheck all of the looping indefinitely's, let's make this 2, let's make this 3, let's make this 5. If we play it now, it'll choose randomly for one of those, and can add some interest, especially in cases where you have that blacksmith hammering or a cricket that chirps a certain amount of times. While having sounds loop a finite amount of times is very useful, I find the most useful aspect is when you have it at the very end of your string in order to have the whole thing continue to looping when you're creating ambient sounds. Now, as some of you have probably noticed, there seems to be something odd about how this currently sounds. When it's looping, the sounds play directly after one another, which isn't the most natural. A way to combat this is using the delay node. How we use the delay node is it gives you the options to set a minimum and maximum delay before it plays again. If we were to run this through here and place it right before the looping node, this allows us to set, let's say, 2 to 3 seconds of pause before it loops again. So let's press play. Played twice. It's waiting 2 to 3 seconds, then chooses another node. This allows it to feel less like just a distinct loop, especially with one-shots like this, and allows you to add some interest and as much varying time delay as you would like. But let's say you want to add even more interest to your sounds and make it sound a bit more unique. The way that you do this is through the modulator node. The modulator node allows you to set a modulation for the pitch and the volume that varies between these minimum and maximum that you set. When this plays through, even though it'll choose a random sound, it'll then vary the pitch for that entire sound and volume to a random amount, so it's never at the exact same volume or pitch as it was before. So to give you an extreme example, let's say 1 and 5, and 1 and 5. It'll choose a value between 1 and 5 every time it re-loops, and that'll make it sound quite interesting. As you can tell, each time that played, the pitch and the volume of the whole sound coming out of the random was changed. I find this modulator delay looping path to be one of the most common things that I do when creating ambient sounds with sound cues. The modulator adds a little bit of interest, the delay makes sure the timing varies each time, and then the looping allows it to continue to play in the background throughout my ambient sound design. However, one thing you want to watch for is placing the looping before the delay. If we do that, the sound will never pass this looping node. It will just continue to loop here and never reach that delay, and we'll be left with what we had previously. And that's not what we want. While the modulator gives you control over the overall pitch or volume of a sound, the enveloper gives you an even finer control. By running a sound through the enveloper, it allows you to change how the sound behaves over time for both pitch and volume. In this case, we're going to be using this wave player that is Trees01, which sounds a little bit dull as just a stagnant sound in the background. So what we instead want to do is we want to utilize the enveloper in order to change it over time. Now, the first setting that we're going to talk about is the actual envelope itself. Now, you have a volume curve and a pitch curve. And in order to open these up, you just double-click in one of the graphs, and that opens it up right here. Now, what this graph actually describes is the vertical axis is, in this case, the volume level, which you can see goes from 0 to 1, and it currently just sits at 1. And then the horizontal axis is time. Now, what it currently has is very small amounts of time, since we only have this one point on the graph. So if we wanted to add another point, all you do is go to the line, hold down Shift, and click. This places a new node that we can now control. This first section is the time, which, let's say we want this to last the whole length of the clip, which in order to know that, we first need to know the length of the tree's wind. An easy way to do that is if we go to the content drawer and hover over this, you can see within here, 5 spots down, that the duration is 12. That means that this particular wave file runs for 12 seconds. So let's go back in here, click on this node, and have this go all the way to the end at 12 seconds. Now, as you can see, the node went off the screen. We can no longer see it, but an easy way to now see it is if we click this zoomed fit horizontal, it zooms out and we can now see both of those values. So let's say over that 12 seconds, we want it to go from full volume all the way down to 0. Let's do that. So if we were to then play this node, you'll hear that it starts at the normal volume, then over the 12 seconds, slowly diminishes in volume. However, you can do much more than just linear functions within the volume curve. If I wanted to add another node, I could just hold Shift again and click, and let's drag it up like this. But you might not want it to be so jagged. If you have it too jagged, it can cause a bit of a clicking noise within the sound, so we want this to be a bit smoother. So the way to do that is if we select all these nodes by holding down Control, and then we right-click, you can choose Key Interpolation, which allows you to either have an automatic curve, have a user curve, which is where you put in the curves, you can do a break, we're currently in linear, or a constant interpolation. So to show you, I usually like to just do the auto, and this shows you now a very nice curve going throughout here. You can adjust these by clicking on the node and dragging like this, This allows you to create more interesting curves and have full control over how you want it to sound. So to show you how this sounds, till it fades out. So you can do the same thing with pitch. Let's just do a quick example of that. I'm going to create a new node. I'm going to make the time 12, make the value 3. Oh, messed that up a little bit. So let's just zoom to horizontal, make the value 3, and then zoom to fit vertical. Then if we play the node, as you could hear, the pitch and the volume are now varying independently. This gives you tons of options for creating interesting sounds to make monotonous sounds such as this wind even more interesting. You could do this with bees buzzing to make it sound like it's coming closer to you, or many other applications within the Unreal Engine. A couple other features that this has is that it has a modulation, much like our modulation node, and that allows you to change each time it plays the overall pitch or the overall volume, while it will still follow the same curve, just starting at a different spot. Now, in order to actually make it loop, you could either put a looping node in here before the output, or it has a looping feature within here. You first need to make sure that the loop is checked. If you want it to loop indefinitely, you could just click that. Then if you were to set the loop start and end, that allows you to choose at what point in the curve you end up starting and stopping. We're just going to have it be 0 and 12, just like the length of the sound. And then if we press play, well, of course, we have to have it in the output. Now, if you'll notice, that ended up stopping even though we have it set to loop. The reason for that is that the wave player ran out of sound, so we need to set it to looping in order to make that work. As you can hear, it just continues to loop, or you could have it loop a certain amount of times, including this loop count. Let's just say you want it to do this first 4 seconds 3 times. Let's do 4, goes from 0 to 4 seconds, then it'll loop 3 times. Let's just press play. There you go. Loop through that section 3 times. This allows you to do a lot of different things with the sound, the volume, the pitch, just make it overall much more interesting. The last node that we're going to be talking about for the ambient side of things is the concatenator. Now, a lot of the stuff that we've been working with so far has been the sounds either playing one at a time in a random order or playing multiple on top of each other. Let's say you wanted certain sounds to happen in a certain sequence. So in this case, there's the lake water lapping, so say there's a wave, and then that ends up knocking a boat back and forth. You wouldn't really want the boat knock to play first before the lake water lapping, so you want it to play in a specific order. And that is where the concatenator comes in. So all you have to do is just create the number of inputs that you want and attach them in the order that you want them to play. So then when we click the output, it plays those in that order. This is for specific scenarios when you want things to happen in a certain sequence in order to help build out your ambient sound design. Another use for this node is making the most of the sounds that you have. Now, there may be some sounds in your level, such as an owl that's hooting, that might have multiple parts to the sound. So, say there's this. It's a bit of a two-parter sound. So you could just have all of these paired up and just choose from one of those two, and that'll give you a good amount of random sounds. However, since this has pretty distinct parts to it, a twit and a twoo as this is labeled, we can use the concatenator to combine the different parts of this between the different sounds. So you could do the twit from 4 and the twoo from 3. And the way we do this is you select a random one of the twits and a random one of the twoos, and put that in the order that you want with the concatenator. So then if we play this, You then have even more randomness out of only a finite number of sounds. This can be a really useful way to continue to make your ambience more realistic. The nodes that we have covered so far are the most common nodes used when designing ambient sounds for gameplay. The next nodes we will primarily be talking about are going to be the effects and different ways to incorporate gameplay mechanics into your sound cues. I'll be touching on these briefly, but I won't go as in-depth as the previous nodes. To start off, we'll be talking about the attenuation node, and what this does, it allows you to apply an attenuation on a certain sound in a cue or at a different point in the cue. There may be certain sounds that you don't want to travel as far as others, or you may want to only change the attenuation for this specific sound cue and not affect it in other sound cues. It works the same as attenuation in ambient sound actors and on the cue itself, giving you the option to override or apply an attenuation directly. In a similar vein, the sound class allows you to change the sound class of a particular sound at a point in the node, which again we will be covering sound classes in a future tutorial. One of the first effects we're going to talk about is the Doppler. Now the Doppler effect, for those of you that don't know, is how a sound behaves when you are moving past a sound source. The most common example is, think those movies where you're driving next to a truck and it goes, that is the Doppler effect. And so, this applies directly to the sound and is affected by how quickly you are moving by the sound cue. So to show you an example, Village Window work. You'll just have this Doppler effect playing, make sure it's looping so we have plenty of time. This Doppler intensity is how intense the Doppler effect is going to be, seems pretty clear. And then smoothing allows you to choose exactly how fast your interpolation speed is when changing between the different effects. This could be running past it or back towards it, anything like that. So to give you an example, let's make it pretty aggressive, make it like a 5. To demonstrate this, I'm going to put it into the level, and just like wave files and ambient sound actors, you can just drag the sound cue into the level, and it will be ready to go. So first I want to make sure that it has a spatialization activated. So I'm just going to override that attenuation and make sure that spatialization is on, which it is, and let's press play. So the sound sounds pretty normal right now, but if I were to run past it, you can hear that when I move towards it, it sounds higher pitched, and when I'm away from it, it goes lower. And that is an example of the Doppler effect. Next, the oscillator. This allows you to apply continuous oscillation to a sound with either the volume or the pitch. So instead of just choosing a solid pitch to stay at or a solid volume to stay at, like the modulator, this allows it to continuously change based on the settings that you put here. Amplitude will be how loud the difference is between the loudest and the quietest. There's the frequency, which shows you exactly how fast it will be oscillating. And then there's the offset and center min max, which aren't as important, but it just changes where it is relatively sitting. So if you want it to go from really loud to kinda loud, or really loud to no sound, these are the ones that will change that. The next node that we're going to be talking about is the dialogue player. Now what this does, it's similar to a wave player, but is specifically made for things of dialogue. It allows you to choose the actual dialogue wave, as well as choose who is speaking and who it is directed at. You can even have it looping in the background if you would like, say for NPCs or something like that. This is very important for gameplay when you're figuring out who's saying what lines when, and can give you some extra information, especially for the gameplay developer, but I personally have not dived into this very much. Next up is the mature output. This node allows you to flag a section of dialogue as mature, so then if someone has for mature audiences on or off, it'll change which dialogue line is used, which is a quite useful feature for integrating this into your gameplay. Next up is the group control, which, as it says here, it plays a different sound depending on the number of active sounds. This can be useful for making sure that not too many sounds in your node are playing at once, and can help with voice management and memory management within gameplay. The next is the quality level, which primarily is used for gameplay mechanics and making sure that it changes the quality of your sound in case you really need to be squeezing every ounce of RAM and CPU possible from your game. These last few nodes that we are going to be talking about depend on parameters in a blueprint elsewhere in the level. An example of this would be if you needed a piece of dialogue to change based on whether or not you had picked up an item, such as a flower. This would change a parameter that says got item and could then affect your sound cue to play a certain dialogue line. However, sound cues don't have the functionality to do these changes themselves, so it must be done in another blueprint. The first one we will be talking about is the wave parameter, which allows you to play a wave player based on a parameter in another blueprint. All you would have to do is type in the exact name of that parameter, and then, as I was saying earlier, if you changed it to got flowers as true, it would then play this level of dialogue and therefore affect the sound cue. The next one is the switch node, which would allow you to change which piece of dialogue is played based on that parameter. So say, again, if we had, depending on how many mushrooms you picked up, if you had none picked up, it would choose this. If you had one picked up, it would play that level of dialogue. Or if you had two picked up, it would play this level of dialogue. This allows you to choose exactly which dialogue piece plays, depending on that parameter. The next is a branch option, which works for Boolean functionality, which just means something can be either true or false, like that flower example. You either do or you do not have the flower. You set an option for true, an option for false, and an option for the parameter if it is unset. So in case there's something that went wrong with the game, it'll still play a line of dialogue that you can set for the parameter unset. The next up is the continuous modulator, and what this does is it varies the modulation of the sound based on another parameter. This could be used for an engine sound where it might raise in pitch and volume depending on how fast you're going, and this allows you to incorporate those directly into your sound cues, the sound source. This could be useful for something like with a tornado. You may hear only low rumbling frequencies when you're further away. Then the closer you get, you hear more whooshing, something like that. It's just sounds that vary according to distance in that case, or any parameter that you would have in regard to that. Then the crossfade by distance, as I was mentioning before, is like that basic example, but this is only allowed to be done with distance, while this one allows you to do that for any parameter. The final node in here is more for organizational purposes and is the add comment. If you drag that in, all you have to do is just fit your nodes within here, type a comment, let's call this output. This allows you to label your sound cues in case you have a lot of different things going on. It really helps to organize it, and then when you move it, it moves everything within it. Very great for organizational purposes. And this concludes our overview of sound cues in the Unreal Engine. With the tools that I have outlined in this tutorial, you should be able to create most of the ambient sounds within your practice level. In the exercise sheet, I have outlined all the sounds that I would recommend you practice creating, as well as providing tips for how to make each of the sound cues. But for now, I will see you in the next tutorial.